The grand estate of Ashworth Manor stood against the English countryside like a monument to forgotten elegance, its stone walls weathered by countless seasons, its gardens stretching toward horizons that seemed to promise both escape and imprisonment. Within those walls lived a man who had long ago ceased to believe in promises of any kind. Duke Arthur Ashworth moved through the corridors of his ancestral home like a ghost haunting his own life. At 40 years of age, he possessed the bearing of a man who had seen too much and felt too little, his handsome features arranged in an expression of permanent distance. The servants whispered that he had not smiled genuinely in 15 years, not since that terrible morning when his bride had failed to appear at the chapel, choosing instead to run away with a cavalry officer whose charm had eclipsed whatever affection she had pretended to hold for Arthur. The scandal had reverberated through society with the force of thunder. Some pitied him, others whispered that perhaps he had been too cold, too remote, too consumed with duty to truly win a woman's heart. Arthur had heard the whispers and had chosen to prove them right. If the world believed him incapable of love, then incapable he would be. He closed the chambers of his heart with locks forged from pride and pain, and he threw away the keys into depths he had no intention of ever exploring again. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Eleanor, had watched her son's transformation with quiet desperation. She had seen the light fade from his eyes, watched him retreat into books and business, into the management of estates and the cold calculations of politics. She had tried, in her gentle way, to coax him back to life, but Arthur had been resolute in his solitude. And now, as age crept upon her with its inevitable weight, Eleanor found herself needing assistance she had long resisted. The advertisement for a lady's companion had been placed discreetly, the requirements exacting. Eleanor wanted someone educated but not pretentious, refined but not artificial, capable of both conversation and silence. She wanted, though she did not say so explicitly, someone who might bring a spark of life back into the tomb her home had become. Lady Marian Sutherland arrived on a crisp autumn morning when the leaves were just beginning to surrender their green to gold. She stepped down from the carriage with a grace that seemed effortless, her modest travelling dress doing nothing to diminish the natural elegance of her bearing. At 26, she possessed that particular beauty that combines youth with something deeper, a quality of spirit that illuminates from within. Her eyes, a remarkable shade of grey that shifted like storm clouds, took in the imposing facade of Ashworth Manor with neither intimidation nor presumption, merely quiet appreciation. The butler, Harrison, a man whose service to the Ashworth family spanned 4 decades, found himself momentarily arrested by her smile as he welcomed her. It was not a smile calculated to charm or manipulate, but rather one that suggested genuine warmth, a natural kindness that seemed to radiate without effort. Harrison, who prided himself on his imperviousness to the parade of visitors who passed through the manor's doors, felt something shift in his carefully maintained professional demeanour. "Welcome to Ashworth Manor, Lady Marian," he said, his formal tone softening almost imperceptibly. "The Dowager Duchess is expecting you." Marian's circumstances, though she carried herself with dignity, were humbler than her title might suggest. She was the daughter of a baron whose estate had been lost to unfortunate investments and whose death had left his family with little beyond their name and their pride. Marian had chosen service over charity, preferring the honest work of companionship to the degrading dependency on distant relatives. She had come to Ashworth Manor with no expectations beyond doing her duty well and maintaining the independence that mattered more to her than any social pretension. The Dowager Duchess received her in the morning room, a space flooded with light from tall windows that overlooked the eastern gardens. Eleanor Ashworth, despite her years and declining health, possessed a keen intelligence that missed very little. She studied the young woman before her with eyes that had spent a lifetime reading character, and what she saw pleased her immensely. "My dear," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the refined accent of her generation, "I hope you will find your situation here agreeable. I am not a demanding mistress, though I confess I value good conversation and am dreadfully impatient with insincerity." Marian's response was immediate and genuine. "Your Grace, I believe sincerity is the only currency worth trading in human relationships. I would not know how to offer you anything less." Eleanor smiled, a true smile that reached her eyes. Then we shall deal beautifully together. Come, sit beside me and tell me something true about yourself. Not the practiced responses you prepared for this interview, but something real. It was an unusual request, one that might have flustered a less genuine person, but Marian seemed to consider it seriously before speaking. I love gardens, Your Grace. Not the formal kind that exist merely to display wealth, but the kind where things grow a bit wild, where roses climb over stone walls and herbs spread their fragrance without permission. I think there is something honest about a garden that is allowed to be a little untamed. Eleanor's eyes brightened with unmistakable pleasure. My son maintains that the gardens must be kept in perfect order, every hedge trimmed to geometric precision, every flower bed arranged according to some incomprehensible scheme his groundskeeper devised. I have often thought it a pity to force such rigid control on living things. Perhaps you will be an ally in my quiet rebellion. And so Marian's life at Ashworth Manor began. Her duties were neither onerous nor trivial. She read aloud to the Dowager Duchess, whose eyes tired easily. She accompanied her on gentle walks through the house, and weather permitting through the gardens. She wrote letters at Eleanor's dictation, managed the household correspondence that the Duchess still insisted on maintaining, and provided the companionship of intelligent conversation that Eleanor had missed more than she had realized. But it was in her free hours that Marian revealed the truest part of herself. She had negotiated, as part of her position, access to a small section of the garden that had been allowed to fall into neglect. It was tucked away behind the conservatory, shielded from the formal lawns by a high hedge of yew. The head gardener, a taciturn man named Thomas, had shown her the space with evident skepticism. "Nothing's been done with it for years, my lady," he had said, his tone suggesting she would soon abandon the project. "The soil's probably exhausted." Marian had knelt and run her fingers through the earth, finding it rich and dark beneath the surface weeds. "Soil is rarely exhausted, Thomas. It merely needs attention and patience. Rather like people, I suspect." She began her work on the garden immediately, spending her afternoon hours with her hands in the dirt, her modest work dresses protected by an old apron she had found in the servants' quarters. She planted herbs first, rosemary and thyme and lavender, creating borders that would eventually frame the space. Then came the roses, varieties she had carefully selected from the greenhouse stock that Thomas grudgingly admitted no one had ordered. It was during one of these afternoon sessions, perhaps 3 weeks after her arrival, that Duke Arthur first truly noticed her. He had been crossing the grounds, returning from a morning spent with his steward reviewing tenant concerns, his mind occupied with drainage systems and crop rotations and all the practical matters that filled his carefully controlled existence. A flash of color in his peripheral vision made him glance toward the forgotten corner of the garden, and he stopped abruptly. A young woman knelt among the newly turned earth, her dark hair escaping from its pins, her face tilted toward the sun with an expression of such complete contentment that it seemed to belong to another world entirely. She was humming something, a melody he could not quite identify, and her hands moved through the soil with the tenderness one might use to touch something precious. For a moment, Arthur found himself unable to look away, transfixed by the simple beauty of the scene, by the uncomplicated joy radiating from this person who seemed to exist in a state of grace he had forgotten was possible. Then she looked up, her eyes meeting his across the distance, and smiled. It was not a smile of recognition or greeting, merely acknowledgement of a shared moment, the simple human connection of one person seeing another. Arthur felt something crack inside his chest, a sensation so unfamiliar that he mistook it initially for physical pain. He nodded stiffly, almost curtly, and turned away, continuing his journey back to the house with his heart beating in an irregular rhythm that alarmed him. Harrison, observing his master's return from his station in the entrance hall, noted the unusual color in the Duke's face and the distracted quality of his gaze. The butler said nothing, but he filed the observation away with the particular attention he paid to anything that might herald change in a household that had remained static for far too long. That evening, Arthur found himself asking his mother, with studied casualness, about her new companion. Eleanor, who had been waiting for this question with barely contained anticipation, kept her expression neutral as she responded. "Lady Marian?" She is quite wonderful, Arthur. Intelligent without being tedious about it, kind without being weak, and possessed of a remarkable ability to make one forget she is performing a service at all. I feel as though I have gained a friend rather than employed a companion." Arthur absorbed this information while pretending to study the document before him. "She is young for such a position," he observed. 26, Eleanor confirmed, "though I find her remarkably mature for her years. Life has taught her lessons that many women of her age, protected by wealth and position, never learn. She has known loss and chosen resilience. I admire that greatly." Arthur said nothing more, but that night, alone in his chambers, he found his thoughts returning again and again to the image of the young woman in the garden. Her face turned toward the sun like a flower seeking light. He told himself it was merely the novelty of a new person in the household, that his attention would fade as familiarity bred indifference. He told himself this, but some part of him recognized the lie. The household settled into new rhythms with Marian's presence. The servants, initially wary of change, found themselves warming to her genuine interest in their lives, her lack of pretension, her willingness to acknowledge them as human beings rather than merely functional elements of the domestic machinery. Cook discovered that Marian knew a remarkable amount about herbs and their uses, both culinary and medicinal. The housemaids appreciated her habit of tidying her own rooms, sparing them extra work. Even Thomas, the skeptical gardener, admitted to Harrison that the girl knew what she was about with plants. Eleanor blossomed under the attention of her new companion. The two women developed a routine of morning conversations over tea, afternoon reading, and evening walks when the weather permitted. Marian proved to be an excellent reader, capable of bringing even dry historical texts to life with her expressive voice. She listened with genuine interest to Eleanor's stories of earlier times, her memories of a society that had vanished, her reflections on a long life that had known both joy and sorrow. It was during one of these conversations that Eleanor first mentioned her son's tragedy, though she did so delicately, unsure how much the younger woman already knew from household gossip. "Arthur was not always as he is now," Eleanor said quietly, her fingers working at the embroidery she kept more for occupation than any real interest. "He was once quite different, lighter somehow, more open to the world." Marian, who had been pouring tea, paused to give the older woman her full attention. "What changed him, if I may ask?" Eleanor's expression grew distant, her eyes focusing on something beyond the walls of the room. "A betrayal of the heart. The kind that makes a person question not just another's love, but their own capacity to judge, to trust, to feel. He was engaged to be married, you see, a beautiful girl from an excellent family. Everything seemed perfect. Everything was arranged. And then, on the morning of their wedding, she ran away with another man." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with old pain. Marian felt her heart contract with sympathy for a man she barely knew, imagining the humiliation, the grief, the shattering of a future once thought certain. "How terrible," she said softly. "For everyone involved." Eleanor looked at her with approval. "You see clearly, my dear. Yes, it was terrible for all. For Arthur, obviously, but also for the girl, who I believe acted from panic rather than malice, and who I heard later regretted her choice bitterly. And for me, watching my son transform from someone full of hope into someone who has armored himself against ever feeling anything again." 15 years is a long time to carry such hurt, Marian observed. "Indeed. And I fear he has become comfortable in his isolation. Comfortable may be the wrong word. Perhaps accustomed is better. He has built a life that requires nothing of his heart, and I watch him growing older in a kind of living death. It grieves me more than my own mortality." Marian understood then the real reason for her employment, the hope that perhaps a young woman's presence in the house might somehow thaw the frozen Duke. She felt no resentment at this hidden agenda, only a deep compassion for a mother's love and worry. But she also knew her place, knew the vast gulf that separated a duke from his mother's paid companion, and she had no illusions about her role in this household. Yet life, in its mysterious way, seemed determined to place Arthur and Marian in each other's paths. He began to appear in places where she worked, always with some plausible reason. He needed to consult with the head gardener and found her there, discussing the best location for a climbing rose. He was checking on his mother's comfort and arrived during their afternoon reading. He was taking a constitutional through the gardens and encountered her returning from her own walk, her arms full of cut flowers for the house. Each encounter was brief, their conversations limited to polite formalities. Yet something passed between them in those moments, something neither could quite name or deny. Arthur found himself listening for her voice in the corridors, found his attention drifting from his work toward the window that overlooked the garden where she spent her afternoons. He told himself he was merely ensuring his mother's companion was performing her duties adequately. He told himself this lie repeatedly and believed it less each time. Marian, for her part, felt the weight of the Duke's attention and tried to understand it. She had no vanity about her appearance, though she knew herself to be reasonably attractive. She had no illusions about her position or her prospects. Yet she could not deny the flutter in her chest when she unexpectedly encountered him. The way her pulse quickened when his dark eyes met hers, the peculiar warmth that spread through her at the rare sound of his voice, directed toward her. She tried to discipline her thoughts, reminding herself of every reasonable argument against such foolishness. He was a duke. She was a paid companion. He was 15 years her senior. He was her employer's son. He had been publicly humiliated by love, and had clearly chosen never to risk his heart again. The obstacles were insurmountable, the very idea ridiculous. Yet her heart, untrained in logic, continued its increasingly insistent rhythm whenever he was near. Winter came early that year, bringing frost that silvered the gardens and made outdoor work impossible. Marian's garden, carefully put to bed for the cold months, waited beneath its blanket of mulch and fallen leaves. She spent more time indoors now, her afternoons devoted to helping Eleanor organize the Duchess's correspondence and personal papers, a project the older woman had long postponed. It was during one of these sessions that Eleanor asked, with the careful casualness that often preceded important revelations, "You have never married, Marian?" The younger woman looked up from the letter she was filing, her expression thoughtful. "No, Your Grace. I was engaged once, briefly, when I was 21, but he died of fever before we could marry." Eleanor's face softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm so sorry, my dear. That must have been devastating." Marian was quiet for a moment, her fingers still on the paper she held. "It was difficult, certainly. But I have come to believe that grief, while painful, taught me something valuable. It taught me that love is a risk worth taking, even when it ends in loss. The brief happiness I knew with him was worth the sorrow that followed. I would not trade having loved him to spare myself the pain of losing him." These words, spoken with simple sincerity, seemed to resonate in the room long after they were uttered. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, understanding suddenly the quality that made this young woman so remarkable. She had known real loss and had chosen not to let it harden her heart. She had learned the lesson Arthur had refused to learn, that vulnerability was strength rather than weakness, that an open heart, however much it might be hurt, was infinitely more alive than one locked away in protective isolation. "You are wise beyond your years," Eleanor said softly. Marian smiled a little sadly. "I am not wise, Your Grace. I am merely honest about my own limitations. I know I cannot control how others behave, cannot protect myself from all possible pain. So I choose instead to remain open to whatever joy might come, even knowing that joy often comes paired with sorrow. It seems to me the only way to truly live." Eleanor reached out and squeezed the younger woman's hand. "My dear, you have given me a great gift today. You have reminded me that wisdom and youth are not mutually exclusive, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is refuse to let pain make us smaller." That evening, Eleanor took the unusual step of requesting her son join her for dinner. Arthur, who typically took his meals alone in his study, could not refuse his mother's direct invitation without rudeness. He arrived in the dining room with his customary punctuality, his formal evening dress impeccable, his expression arranged in its familiar mask of polite distance. To his surprise, Lady Marian was also present, seated at the table in a simple dinner gown that somehow made her more striking than the elaborate fashions worn by the society women he occasionally encountered. He felt his carefully maintained composure waver at the sight of her, at the way the candlelight played across her features, creating shadows and light that seemed to reveal depths he had not previously noticed. "Arthur," his mother said warmly, "I have taken the liberty of inviting Lady Marian to dine with us. I hope you do not object. I find I so enjoy her company that I am loath to part with it even for a meal." Arthur bowed slightly, his eyes meeting Marian's briefly before sliding away. "Of course, Mother. Lady Marian is always welcome at your table." The meal began with the awkward formality of near strangers forced into social proximity. Eleanor, however, was determined to breach the walls her son had constructed, and she began to direct the conversation with the skill of a general maneuvering troops. "Marian was just telling me earlier about her philosophy regarding loss and love," Eleanor said, her tone light but her intention serious. "I found it quite illuminating." Arthur felt his jaw tighten, sensing a trap but unable to identify its exact nature. "Indeed," he said noncommittally. Marian, acutely aware of the undercurrents in the room, wished desperately to be anywhere else. She had no desire to be used as an instrument in whatever campaign the Dowager Duchess was waging on behalf of her son's emotional well-being. Yet she could not be rude to her employer, could not refuse to engage in the conversation without causing offense. "I merely said that I believe love is worth risking, despite the possibility of loss," she said quietly, her eyes on her plate. "That the experience of loving, however briefly, enriches us in ways that safety and isolation cannot." Arthur felt these words land in his chest like arrows finding their mark. His first instinct was anger, a defensive rage at what he perceived as criticism of his choices, his life, his careful construction of immunity from feeling. But beneath the anger, something else stirred, something he had thought long dead, a whisper that suggested she might be right, that his safety had come at a terrible cost he had refused to calculate. "A romantic philosophy," he said, his voice carrying an edge of coldness, "but perhaps one more easily maintained by those who have not experienced the particular humiliation of being publicly abandoned." The words were cruel, calculated to wound, to create distance, to punish this young woman for the crime of disturbing his carefully maintained equilibrium. He regretted them immediately, seeing the color drain from Marian's face, the quick flash of hurt in her eyes before she lowered them to her lap. Eleanor's voice, when she spoke, carried a sharpness Arthur had rarely heard. "That was unworthy of you, Arthur. Lady Marian lost her betrothed to death, a loss that carries its own devastation and humiliation, the knowledge that she will never see him again, never have the chance to build the life they planned. Yet she has chosen to honor that love by remaining open to life rather than closing herself off from it. I suggest there is more courage in that choice than in hiding from risk." The silence that followed was excruciating. Arthur felt shame wash over him, hot and uncomfortable. Recognizing the truth in his mother's rebuke, he had lashed out like a wounded animal, striking at the very person who least deserved his venom. He looked at Marian, who sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully composed. "Lady Marian," he said, his voice rough with emotion he could not quite suppress, "I apologize. That was inexcusable. You have done nothing to warrant such discourtesy." Marian raised her eyes to his, and in their grey depths he saw not anger or resentment, but something far more devastating: compassion. She looked at him as though she saw not the wealthy duke, not the cold master of the manor, but a wounded man hiding behind walls of his own construction. "Your Grace," she said softly, "no apology is necessary. I understand that pain, when it goes unhealed, can make us speak in ways we do not intend. I take no offense." Her generosity in the face of his cruelty undid something in Arthur. He found himself unable to maintain her gaze, unable to sustain the defensive posture that had served him for so long. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he had not permitted himself to feel since that terrible morning when his bride had failed to appear. The rest of the meal passed in relative quiet, the conversation turning to neutral topics that required nothing more than polite responses. When it ended, Arthur excused himself quickly, retreating to his study where he stood at the window overlooking the darkened gardens, his hands braced against the sill, his mind in turmoil. He had spent 15 years constructing a life of careful emptiness, an existence that required nothing of his heart, and therefore protected him from further injury. He had been content, or so he had told himself, with his books and his duties, with the management of estates and the distant observation of other people's lives. But Marian's presence in his household had disrupted that contentment, had revealed it for what it truly was, not peace but the absence of life itself. He thought of her in the garden, her face turned toward the sun. He thought of her voice reading to his mother, warm and expressive. He thought of her words at dinner, the simple courage of choosing vulnerability over safety. And he felt, for the first time in 15 years, the terrible and wonderful stirring of something he had thought dead, the capacity to feel. The realization terrified him. To feel again meant to risk again, to expose himself to possible pain, to acknowledge that his armor had never really protected him, but had merely prevented him from living. Yet the alternative, continuing as he had been, suddenly seemed unbearable. Marian had shown him, without intending to, what it looked like to live with an open heart, and he found he could no longer pretend he didn't want that for himself. Sleep would not come easily that night. Arthur lay in his bed, staring at the canopy above him, and allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he had been avoiding. He was falling in love with Lady Marian Sutherland. The admission brought with it a flood of conflicting emotions, fear and hope and desire and terror, all tangled together in a knot he did not know how to untie. Meanwhile, in her own modest room in another wing of the house, Marian sat by the window and looked out at the moonlit gardens. She too had reached a recognition she could no longer deny. Despite every reasonable objection, despite the impossibility of the situation, despite her determination to remain sensible and pragmatic, she had developed feelings for the Duke that went far beyond what was appropriate or wise. She tried to trace how this had happened, how she had moved from professional distance to this aching awareness of his presence, this quickening of her pulse when he was near, this overwhelming desire to reach through his defenses and touch the wounded man she sensed beneath the cold exterior. But feelings, she had learned, rarely followed logical paths. They simply arrived, uninvited and undeniable, and one had to decide how to respond to them. Marian knew what she should do. She should request a transfer to another household, should remove herself from a situation that could only lead to pain for everyone involved. A duke did not fall in love with his mother's paid companion. Such things did not happen outside of novels, and even if by some miracle he did develop feelings for her, the scandal, the social impossibility, the damage to both their reputations would be immense. Yet even as she catalogued all the rational reasons to flee, she knew she would not. She would stay because Eleanor needed her, because she had given her word, because she was not in the habit of running from difficult situations. And perhaps, though she barely admitted this even to herself, because some small, irrational part of her hoped that the impossible might somehow become possible. The following days brought a subtle shift in the household's atmosphere. Arthur began to appear more frequently in the common areas of the house, abandoning his usual isolation. He would join his mother for tea, arriving when he knew Marian would be present. He would walk the corridors at times when he might reasonably encounter her. He began, in small and tentative ways, to seek her presence without quite acknowledging he was doing so. Harrison observed these changes with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had served the family long enough to understand what they meant. He began to ensure that the paths of the Duke and Lady Marian crossed more often, arranging small coincidences that brought them into proximity. Cook, informed of these developments through the mysterious communication network that exists below stairs in every great house, began to prepare meals that required Marian to be present at more dinners. Eleanor, recognizing the delicate nature of what was developing, tried to create opportunities for her son and her companion to interact while being careful not to push so hard that Arthur's defenses would re-erect themselves. She encouraged Arthur to share his knowledge of the estate's history with Marian, suggesting that the young woman's genuine interest in such matters deserved to be cultivated. She requested that Arthur take them both on a tour of the portrait gallery, knowing that the stories behind those painted faces might reveal something of himself to a woman who was learning to read the man beneath the title. It was during this tour that something shifted between them. Arthur, explaining the history of his family through the generations of faces staring down from the walls, found himself speaking with more animation than he had in years. Marian listened with complete attention, asking intelligent questions that demonstrated her genuine interest. When they reached the portrait of Arthur's father, the previous duke who had died when Arthur was barely 18, she studied it carefully before turning to Arthur. "You have his eyes," she said softly, "but yours carry more sadness. I hope you will not think me impertinent for saying so, but I believe your father would not wish for you to bear that sadness forever." Arthur felt something crack in his chest, a fissure in the wall he had built so carefully. "You speak as though you knew him," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I did not," Marian replied, still looking at the portrait. "But I know something of fathers and daughters, and I have to believe that fathers and sons are not so different. My own father, despite his failures, wanted happiness for me more than anything. I think that is the nature of parental love. It wants joy for its children, not perpetual mourning." Eleanor, who had been observing this exchange with barely concealed emotion, spoke gently. "Your father would indeed be grieved to see how you have lived these past years, Arthur. He believed in love, in joy, in the full experience of life. He would want that for you." Arthur turned away from them both, ostensibly to examine another portrait, but really to hide the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He felt as though layers of protection were being stripped away, leaving him exposed and raw. It was uncomfortable, even painful, but it was also, he realized with surprise, necessary. He had been dead for 15 years, and these two women were insisting he return to life. That evening, unable to sleep once again, Arthur found himself walking the corridors of his home in the dark hours before dawn. He had not intended to go to the conservatory, but his feet seemed to carry him there of their own accord. He was surprised to find lamplight glowing softly within, and more surprised still to find Marian there, seated on a bench among the sleeping plants, a book open in her lap. She looked up at his entrance, startled, her hand moving instinctively to her throat. She was wearing a simple dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders, and Arthur felt his breath catch at the sight of her, at the unguarded beauty of her in this private moment. "Your Grace," she said, starting to rise. "I apologize. I did not think anyone would be here at this hour." "Please," he said quickly, "do not apologize. I am the intruder. I could not sleep and was walking. I did not mean to disturb you." She settled back onto the bench, her eyes uncertain. "I often come here when I cannot sleep. The conservatory feels like a garden even in winter. I hope you do not object." Arthur moved closer, drawn despite his better judgment. "I do not object. May I join you?" The question hung between them, freighted with meaning beyond its simple words. Marian knew she should refuse, should maintain the proper distance, should protect them both from this dangerous proximity. But she found herself nodding, moving slightly to make room on the bench. Arthur sat, carefully maintaining a respectable distance, though he was acutely aware of her presence beside him, of the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling to her, of the way the lamplight caught in her hair. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence between them heavy with things unsaid. "I have been thinking about what you said," Arthur began, his voice low, "about love being worth the risk. I confess I have spent many years believing the opposite, that safety was preferable to the possibility of pain." Marian turned to look at him, her grey eyes luminous in the lamplight. "And now?" she asked softly. "Now," he said, meeting her gaze, "I am no longer certain. You have disrupted my certainty, Lady Marian. You have made me question choices I thought permanent, beliefs I thought unshakable. I have done nothing, Your Grace, except be myself. If that has caused you discomfort, I am sorry." Arthur almost smiled, a real smile that would have stunned anyone who knew him. "Do not apologize for being yourself. That is precisely what has undone me. Your authenticity, your genuine joy, your refusal to hide from life despite having known loss. You have shown me what I have sacrificed in my pursuit of invulnerability." Marian felt her heart race, understanding that they were approaching something significant, something that could not be taken back once acknowledged. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I am merely your mother's companion. Whatever you see in me is surely an illusion, created by proximity, and perhaps by your own desire to feel again. I am not special. I am not remarkable. I am simply a woman trying to do her duty and find some small happiness where she can." "You are wrong," Arthur said, his voice carrying an intensity that made her breath catch. "You are both special and remarkable, though your inability to see that only makes you more so. You have brought light into a house that has been dark for far too long. You have brought life where there was only existence, and you have made me feel things I thought I would never feel again." The confession hung between them, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Marian felt tears prick her eyes, torn between the joy of hearing these words and the terror of what they might mean. "Please," she whispered, "do not say such things. You know as well as I do that nothing can come of them. The gulf between us is too great. The scandal would destroy us both, but particularly you. Your position, your reputation, everything you are would be called into question if you were to have feelings for someone like me." Arthur reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she chose, and took her hand. His touch was gentle, reverent, as though she were something precious and fragile. "Do you think I care about scandal? Do you think reputation matters more to me than this, than what I feel when I am near you? I have lived for 15 years in the prison of other people's opinions, and I find I no longer have any interest in being its captive." "But I care," Marian said, her voice breaking. "I care because you would come to resent me, to blame me for whatever you lost by choosing me. I have seen it happen, Your Grace. I have watched love curdle into bitterness when the price of it becomes clear. I could not bear that. I could not bear to see you look at me one day with regret." Arthur lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent shivers through her entire body. "I regret many things, Lady Marian. I regret the years I have wasted. I regret the life I have not lived. I regret building walls that kept out not just pain but joy. But I promise you, if you will give me the chance, I will never regret choosing you." Marian felt tears spill over, running down her cheeks unchecked. She knew she should pull her hand away, should leave this conservatory and perhaps this house, should protect them both from the consequences of this impossible situation. But she could not. She could not deny what she felt any more than she could deny her own heartbeat. "I am afraid," she whispered. "So am I," Arthur admitted. "I am terrified, but I have learned something these past weeks. Watching you, listening to you, beginning to feel again after years of numbness. I have learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. You taught me that, though you did not know you were doing so." They sat together in the soft lamplight, hands joined, neither quite willing to break the spell of this moment. The conservatory around them seemed to hold its breath, the sleeping plants witness to something fragile and new, taking root in the darkness of winter. Finally, reluctantly, Marian withdrew her hand. "I should return to my room," she said softly. "Dawn will come soon, and your mother will need me." Arthur nodded, though everything in him wanted to protest, to keep her there, to continue this conversation that felt like the first honest exchange he had had in 15 years. "Of course. But Lady Marian, before you go, I must ask you something." She paused, waiting, her heart still racing. "Will you give me time?" he asked. "Time to prove that what I feel is not a passing fancy or the delusion of a lonely man, but something real and enduring. I do not ask for your answer now. I would not presume, but will you give me the opportunity to show you that a future together, however impossible it may seem, is worth pursuing?" Marian looked at him for a long moment, seeing in his face a vulnerability that transformed him, that revealed the man beneath the Duke. She knew she should refuse, should protect them both, but she had spoken truly about love and risk, and she could not deny him what she herself believed. "I will give you time," she said finally, "but I make no promises beyond that. I will not be the cause of your regret, Your Grace. If at any point you realize that the cost is too high, you must promise to tell me honestly, and I will leave without protest or reproach." "I promise," Arthur said, knowing even as he spoke that no such realization would come, that he had already crossed a threshold from which there was no return. They parted then, each returning to their separate wings of the great house, both knowing that sleep would remain elusive. The world had shifted somehow, possibilities had opened that had seemed closed, and neither could quite grasp the enormity of what had passed between them. The dawn brought fresh snow, blanketing the grounds in white silence. Eleanor, taking her morning tea in the small sitting room she favoured, looked out at the transformed landscape and felt hope stir in her aging heart. She had seen something new in her son's face at breakfast, a light that had been absent for so long she had almost forgotten what it looked like. And when Marian arrived to attend her, Eleanor noted the heightened colour in the young woman's cheeks, the way her eyes seemed to hold secrets. "You look well this morning, my dear," Eleanor observed, her tone carefully neutral. Marian busied herself with arranging the breakfast things, not quite meeting the older woman's eyes. "Thank you, Your Grace. The snow is quite beautiful, is it not?" "Quite beautiful," Eleanor agreed, "though I suspect the landscape is not the only thing that has transformed overnight." Marian's hands stilled, and she looked up to find Eleanor watching her with knowing kindness. "Your Grace, You need say nothing, child," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I have eyes. I have also lived long enough to recognize the signs of hearts awakening to each other. I would not pry into private matters, but I would offer you this assurance. Whatever develops between you and my son, you have my blessing and my support." Tears sprang to Marian's eyes. "You are too kind. But surely you must see the impossibility of such a situation. The scandal, the damage to his position. I see a man who has been dead for 15 years beginning to live again," Eleanor said firmly. "I see a woman of quality and character whom any family would be fortunate to welcome. I see two people who might find happiness together if they are brave enough to reach for it. Everything else is merely noise, my dear, and I have lived too long to give noise more weight than it deserves." Marian sat down heavily in the chair opposite Eleanor, her composure crumbling. "I am so afraid," she admitted, "afraid of hoping, afraid of the consequences, afraid of hurting him or being hurt myself. How does one navigate such impossible terrain?" Eleanor reached out and took her hand. "One step at a time, with honesty and courage. You have both in abundance, Marian. Trust them, trust yourself, and yes, there will be challenges. Society can be cruel and small-minded. But I have learned something in my long life. The opinion of society matters far less than the substance of one's own character and the quality of one's relationships. Those who truly matter will understand. Those who do not understand do not truly matter." These words, spoken with the authority of age and experience, gave Marian a measure of comfort. She squeezed Eleanor's hand gratefully, feeling blessed by this woman's wisdom and unexpected support. Arthur, meanwhile, had made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew him. After breakfast, he summoned Harrison to his study and gave the butler instructions that made the older man's eyes widen with surprise and pleasure. "I want you to make arrangements," Arthur said, his voice carrying a determination Harrison had not heard in years. "A dinner party, small and intimate, just our closest friends and neighbors. I realize the timing is unusual, given that we are in the depths of winter, but I find I have a particular reason for wanting to gather people around us." Harrison, who understood perfectly what his master intended, bowed deeply. "It shall be done, Your Grace." "Might I say how pleased I am to undertake this commission?" Arthur almost smiled. "You may say it, Harrison, though I suspect you already have." The preparations began immediately. Invitations were sent to a carefully selected group of people, those whom Arthur knew to be capable of both discretion and open-mindedness. The house, which had been so quiet for so long, suddenly bustled with activity. Rooms were aired and cleaned, crystal and silver were polished. Cook began planning menus with an enthusiasm that spread through the entire staff. Marian watched these preparations with growing anxiety and curiosity. She asked Eleanor what occasion warranted such effort, but the Duchess merely smiled mysteriously and said that Arthur would explain in his own time. That evening, Arthur requested Marian's presence in the library. She came, her hands folded to hide their trembling, unsure what to expect. He stood by the fire, his expression serious but not cold, and gestured to the chair opposite his own. "Please sit," he said. "I have something I wish to discuss with you." Marian sat, her back straight, her heart pounding. Arthur remained standing for a moment, gathering his thoughts, then took the seat across from her. "I have spent the day considering our situation," he began, "and I have come to several conclusions. First, that I am deeply and irreversibly in love with you. Second, that the obstacles between us, while real, are not insurmountable. Third, that I intend to ask you to be my wife, though I will not do so until I have demonstrated to both you and to society that such a union is not only possible, but proper. Marian felt the air leave her lungs. Your Grace. Arthur, he interrupted gently. Please, when we are alone, call me Arthur. I have heard my title from your lips often enough. I would like to hear my name. Arthur, she repeated, the word feeling both foreign and intimate. You cannot be serious. The difference in our positions is a matter of circumstance, not character, he finished. You are the daughter of a baron. Your family is ancient and honorable. That your father's fortunes failed is a tragedy, not a stain on your worth. You are well-educated, well-mannered, and possess more natural grace than most of the women's society would consider appropriate matches for me. The only real obstacle is perception, and I intend to change that perception. How? Marian asked, her voice barely above a whisper. By ensuring that society sees you as I see you, Arthur explained. I am hosting a dinner party in a fortnight. I would like you to attend, not as my mother's companion, but as an honored guest. I will introduce you properly to our circle, allow them to see your qualities, to understand that you are not merely a paid servant, but a gentlewoman whose circumstances have led her to a particular position. Once they know you, once they see what I see, the path forward becomes clearer. Marian shook her head, overwhelmed. But your mother's companion attending as a guest, that in itself will raise questions, start rumors. Let them question, Arthur said with more firmness than she had ever heard from him. Let them wonder. I am not proposing we announce an engagement immediately. I am proposing we begin to shift how you are perceived, to establish you in society's mind as someone who belongs in our world, rather than merely serving it. My mother will support this, as will those I have invited, who are people of sense and understanding. And if it does not work, Marian asked, if society refuses to accept me, if the scandal becomes too great? Arthur leaned forward, his eyes intense. Then we will face that together. But I will not lose you without fighting for you, without doing everything in my power to make a life together possible. I have spent 15 years in cowardice, Marian. I will not spend another day that way. Marian felt tears threaten again, moved beyond words by his determination, his willingness to risk so much. You humble me, she said softly. Your courage shames my doubt. Say you will do this, Arthur urged. Say you will give me the chance to prove that our happiness is worth whatever struggles we might face. Marian looked into his eyes, seeing in them a sincerity that could not be feigned, a love that had somehow grown from the frozen ground of his wounded heart. She thought of her own philosophy, her stated belief that love was worth the risk. Now she was being asked to live that philosophy, to bet her own happiness on its truth. I will do it, she said finally. Not because I believe it will succeed, but because I believe you deserve the chance to try, and because I find I want to try with you. Arthur's face transformed with a smile so genuine, so full of joy, that Marian felt her breath catch. He looked years younger suddenly, the weight of his long grief lifting visibly from his shoulders. He reached across the space between them and took both her hands in his. Thank you, he said simply. I promise you will not regret this trust. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of careful preparation. Eleanor threw herself into the project with an energy that belied her years, working with Marian to ensure the young woman would be properly presented. A dressmaker was brought from London under the pretense of creating new gowns for the Duchess, but it was Marian who was measured and fitted for dresses far grander than anything she had owned before. I cannot accept these, Marian protested, running her hands over the silk of an evening gown in a deep blue that made her eyes seem to shift from grey to silver. You can and you will, Eleanor said firmly. Consider them a gift from a friend, not a charity from an employer. Besides, Arthur has already paid for them, and I think you will find him quite stubborn when his mind is made up. The guests began to arrive on the appointed evening, welcomed into the warm brilliance of Ashworth Manor's grand rooms, which had been brought to glowing life for the occasion. There were perhaps 20 people in total, carefully chosen from among Arthur's oldest friends and most trusted neighbours. Lord and Lady Pemberton, who had known Arthur since childhood, Sir James Whitmore, whose late wife had been Eleanor's dearest friend, the Reverend Thomas Blackwell and his scholarly sister, others of similar quality, people whose judgment Arthur valued and whose discretion he trusted. Marian descended the great staircase in her new gown, her hair dressed in a style that was elegant without being ostentatious, her bearing betraying none of the terror she felt. Eleanor had coached her carefully on how to conduct herself, reminding her that she was a baron's daughter and had every right to be present in such company. Arthur was waiting at the base of the stairs, magnificent in his evening dress, and the look in his eyes as he watched her descend told her everything she needed to know about how she appeared. He offered his arm formally, and she took it, feeling the strength in him, drawing courage from his presence. "You are breathtaking," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "I am terrified," she admitted. "Be terrified if you must," he said, "but also be yourself. That is all I ask, all that is needed." He led her into the drawing room, where the guests had gathered, and the room fell silent as they entered together. Eleanor, already present, smiled with evident satisfaction. Harrison, overseeing the service with his usual impeccable attention to detail, allowed himself the smallest smile of approval. "Friends," Arthur said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I would like to introduce you properly to Lady Marian Sutherland, daughter of the late Baron Sutherland, who has been kind enough to serve as companion to my mother these past months. I hope you will welcome her among us this evening." It was a careful introduction, acknowledging her position while emphasizing her birth, creating space for the guests to accept her without immediately demanding they understand his interest. The guests, well-bred and kind, responded with warmth. Lady Pemberton, a formidable woman with a reputation for seeing through pretense, approached Marian immediately. "My dear Lady Marian," she said, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, "I have heard your name mentioned with great affection by Eleanor. I am delighted to meet you at last. Tell me, is it true you have been working on the abandoned garden behind the conservatory? I have been hoping someone would revive that space for years." And just like that, the ice was broken. Marian found herself drawn into conversation after conversation, each person finding something to engage with, some point of connection. She discovered that Sir James's sister was an accomplished botanist and was soon deep in discussion about medicinal herbs. The Reverend Blackwell wanted to know her opinion on a controversial new translation of Greek poetry. Lord Pemberton, a gentleman farmer with progressive ideas about estate management, sought her thoughts on some theories she had mentioned in passing. Arthur watched from across the room, his heart swelling with pride and vindication. This was exactly what he had hoped for, society seeing what he saw, recognizing her quality without the distorting lens of employment. Eleanor caught his eye and nodded with satisfaction, her faith in her son's judgment confirmed. The dinner itself was a triumph. Marian had been seated in a position of honor, and she engaged with the conversation around her with intelligence and grace, neither pushing herself forward nor shrinking into silence. She told stories that made people laugh, asked questions that showed genuine interest, and demonstrated a breadth of knowledge that surprised several guests who had expected, despite her birth, someone less educated. It was during the dessert course that Lady Pemberton, never one to avoid directness, addressed Arthur publicly. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying the authority of age and position, "I must compliment you on your excellent judgment in friendship. Lady Marian is a delightful addition to any gathering. I do hope we shall see more of her in social situations." Arthur met her eyes steadily, understanding that this was both approval and inquiry. "I hope so as well, Lady Pemberton. I have found Lady Marian's presence in my home to be unexpectedly enriching. I confess I had become rather set in my ways, rather isolated, and she has reminded me of the value of conversation and connection." It was carefully said, acknowledging his interest without being improper, inviting the guests to accept a relationship that was developing without forcing them to confront anything that would create scandal. Lady Pemberton smiled, understanding perfectly what was being communicated, and chose to support it. "Isolation is a terrible thing," she said firmly. "I am glad to see you emerging from it, Your Grace. And I think I speak for all present when I say that any friend of yours is welcome among us?" Murmurs of agreement circled the table, and Marian felt tears threaten at the kindness being shown to her, at the acceptance she had not dared hope for. She caught Arthur's eye across the table and saw in his expression such tenderness, such triumph, that her heart felt too full for her chest to contain it. After dinner, as the guests gathered in the music room where Eleanor had arranged for a small ensemble to play, Arthur found a moment to draw Marian aside into the relative privacy of the conservatory entrance. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I hoped and more. Did you see how they responded to you? How they welcomed you?" "I saw," Marian said, still somewhat dazed by the evening's success. "I can hardly believe it happened. I was so certain they would look down on me, would see only the companion and not the person." "They saw you," Arthur insisted, "just as I see you, and this is only the beginning, Marian. This is how we build the foundation for our future." "Our future?" she repeated wonderingly. "I am beginning to believe such a thing might truly exist." Arthur glanced around to ensure they were unobserved, then took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent shivers through her entire body. "It exists," he said firmly. "I will make certain it exists." The evening drew to a close with expressions of pleasure and promises to gather again soon. As the guests departed, several made a point of speaking to Marian, inviting her to call on them, suggesting activities they might share. Lady Pemberton went so far as to kiss her cheek and whisper, "Be happy, my dear, and do not let pride or propriety stand in the way of happiness. Life is too short for such foolishness." When the last guest had gone, Arthur and his mother and Marian gathered in the small sitting room where Eleanor liked to take her evening tea. The Duchess looked exhausted but deeply satisfied. "That," she announced, "went even better than I hoped. Lady Pemberton's approval is worth a dozen others. Once she accepts someone, society follows. You have been well and truly launched, my dear Marian." "Launched where?" Marian asked, still processing the evening's events. Eleanor and Arthur exchanged glances, and it was Eleanor who answered. "Into society, child. Into the world where you belong by birth and now, thanks to tonight, by acceptance. The path is clearing before you, if you choose to walk it." Marian looked between them, these two people who had somehow decided to champion her, to invest their considerable influence in making the impossible possible. "I do not know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Either of you. You have given me something I did not dare want." "Thank us by being happy," Arthur said simply. "That is all the gratitude I require." The winter deepened around Ashworth Manor, but within its walls, something like spring was beginning to bloom. Arthur emerged from his isolation like a man waking from a long sleep. He began to accept social invitations again, always ensuring that Marian was included when appropriate. He introduced her to more of his circle, each introduction building on the success of the dinner party, gradually establishing her as someone of consequence rather than merely a paid companion. The transformation in him was remarked upon by everyone who knew him. The coldness that had characterized him for so long had melted away, replaced by a warmth that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside. He smiled more readily, laughed at jokes, engaged in conversations with genuine interest rather than mere politeness. It was as though he had been holding his breath for 15 years and had finally remembered how to breathe. Marian continued her duties with Eleanor, but the nature of those duties had shifted subtly. She was less a servant and more a beloved friend who happened to assist with certain tasks. Eleanor delighted in this change, in having not just a companion, but a confidant, someone who could share both her sorrows and her joys. It was on a particularly cold evening, when snow fell heavily outside and fires blazed high in every grate, that Arthur asked Marian to walk with him through the portrait gallery. It had become something of a ritual for them, these evening walks through the history of his family, though both of them knew that the portraits were merely an excuse for privacy, for time together, away from even the well-meaning surveillance of servants and family. They walked slowly, arm in arm now in a way that would have been impossible before the dinner party, before society had begun to accept their connection. Arthur pointed out various ancestors, telling stories he had heard as a child, stories that revealed the humanity behind the formal, painted faces. "My great-grandfather was something of a romantic," he said, pausing before a portrait of a handsome man in the dress of an earlier era. He married a woman considered quite unsuitable by his family, the daughter of a country doctor. There was scandal, of course. His father threatened to disinherit him, but he refused to bend, insisted that love mattered more than position, and eventually the family accepted her. By all accounts, they were remarkably happy together. Marian studied the portrait, seeing in the painted eyes a determination that reminded her of Arthur himself. "Did you think of him when you decided to pursue this path with me?" she asked softly. "I thought of many things," Arthur admitted, "but mostly I thought of waking up in another 15 years, another 30 years, and realizing I had let fear rule my life, that I had let you walk away without fighting for what we might have together. That thought was far more terrifying than any scandal." They had reached the end of the gallery, where a large window overlooked the snow-covered gardens. Arthur drew her to stand before it, looking out at the transformed landscape. "Marian," he said, his voice carrying a quality she had not heard before, something formal yet intimate. "I have waited because I wanted to do this properly, wanted to ensure that society would accept you, that you would not suffer for loving me. But I find I cannot wait any longer. I must know your answer." He turned her to face him, taking both her hands in his. In the lamplight, his eyes shone with an intensity that took her breath away. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you with everything in me, with all that I am and all that I hope to be. You have transformed my life, have given me back something I thought lost forever. I am asking you here and now, with no more delays or strategies or careful plans, will you marry me? Will you become my wife, my duchess, my partner in all things?" Marian felt tears stream down her face, all her carefully maintained composure dissolving in the face of this moment. She had known it was coming, had prepared herself for this question, but the reality of it, the weight and beauty and terror of it, overwhelmed her. "What could I possibly offer you?" she whispered, the words echoing those he had quoted to her so long ago. "I am your mother's companion, a woman with no fortune, no great family left to support me. What can I give you that would be worthy of such love?" Arthur smiled, that true smile that transformed his face, and he pulled her closer until barely any space remained between them. "Give me your love," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That is all I ask. That is all I need. Your love. And the promise that you will walk beside me through whatever comes, that you will let me love you for the rest of my days. Everything else is meaningless compared to that." Marian looked into his eyes and saw her future reflected there, saw all the possibilities she had thought closed to her opening, like flowers reaching toward light. She thought of her own philosophy, her belief in love as a risk worth taking. She thought of his courage in emerging from isolation to reach for happiness. She thought of Eleanor's blessing and society's tentative acceptance and the garden waiting beneath the snow for spring to come. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Yes, I will marry you. I will love you and walk beside you and try to be worthy of the gift you are offering me." Arthur made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, pulling her fully into his arms, holding her as though she were infinitely precious. "You are already worthy," he said against her hair. "You have always been worthy. It is I who hope to be worthy of you." They stood together in the lamplight, two people who had found each other across the impossible distance of circumstance and fear, who had chosen courage over safety, love over protection. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in white silence, but inside, in their arms, warmth bloomed like the promise of spring. Eleanor found them there some time later, still standing at the window, and she understood immediately what had passed between them. She said nothing, merely smiled with satisfaction and joy, and withdrew quietly, giving thanks for prayers answered, for a son restored to life, for a future that had seemed impossible made miraculously real. The engagement was announced shortly after, and society, prepared by the careful campaign Arthur and Eleanor had waged, received it with far more grace than might have been expected. There were whispers, of course, and some disapproval from the most rigid quarters, but the weight of approval from people like Lady Pemberton and others of influence carried the day. Marian was accepted, welcomed even, into a world that might have rejected her had Arthur not been so strategic in his approach. The wedding was planned for spring, when Marian's garden would be in bloom, when the world itself would be celebrating renewal and growth. Arthur wanted to marry sooner, but Marian insisted on waiting, on allowing society more time to adjust, on ensuring that everything was done properly so that no one could question the legitimacy of their union. Those months of waiting were both torturous and joyful. Arthur and Marian were together daily now, no longer needing to hide or excuse their attachment. They walked the grounds planning their future, discussing how they would manage the estates, how they would divide their time between London and Ashworth Manor, how many children they hoped for, and what values they would instill in them. Eleanor watched their happiness with the particular satisfaction of a mother who has seen her child find true joy. She felt her own health begin to fail as winter turned to spring, but she bore it gladly, knowing she had lived long enough to see Arthur saved from the cold isolation that had threatened to consume him entirely. The day of the wedding arrived with sunshine so bright it seemed heaven itself was celebrating. The chapel on the estate grounds, which had been the site of Arthur's great humiliation 15 years before, was transformed by flowers from Marian's garden, by the presence of friends and well-wishers, by the weight of joy that seemed to fill every corner. Arthur stood at the altar, his heart pounding, watching the door through which Marian would enter. For a moment, just a moment, the old fear tried to surface, the memory of another wedding day when his bride had not appeared. But then the music began, and Marian stepped into view, and all fear vanished like morning mist before the sun. She was radiant in a simple gown of white silk, her hair dressed with flowers from her beloved garden, her face glowing with happiness. She walked toward him steadily, her eyes locked on his, and in that walk he saw everything he needed to know about her commitment, her courage, her love. When she reached him, when he took her hand in his, Arthur felt something fundamental settle into place, as though his life had finally found its proper orbit. The ceremony proceeded, the ancient words taking on fresh meaning, the promises made with full hearts and voices that did not waver. I, Arthur James Ashworth, take thee, Marian Elizabeth Sutherland, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. I, Marian Elizabeth Sutherland, take thee, Arthur James Ashworth, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, when Arthur was finally permitted to kiss his bride, the chapel erupted in applause and joy. Eleanor wept openly, as did Lady Pemberton and many others who had watched this unlikely romance develop, who had seen two wounded hearts find healing in each other. The celebration that followed was everything a wedding should be. There was music and dancing, feasting and laughter. Arthur, who had not danced in 15 years, whirled his new duchess around the ballroom with an enthusiasm that made everyone smile. Marian, glowing with happiness, moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and best wishes, her natural grace and kindness winning over even those few who had harbored doubts. As evening fell and the guests began to depart, Arthur and Marian slipped away to the conservatory, where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. They stood together in the gathering darkness, looking out at the garden that had become their special place. "Are you happy?" Arthur asked, though he could see the answer written clearly in her face. "I am happier than I ever imagined possible," Marian replied honestly. "You have given me a life I did not dare dream of, Arthur, not because of the title or the position, but because you have given me yourself, your love, your trust." "It is you who has given me everything," Arthur countered. "You returned me to life, Marian. You showed me that love is not something to fear, but something to embrace. That vulnerability is not weakness, but the greatest strength. Everything I am now, everything good in me, exists because you had the courage to love me despite all the obstacles." They kissed then, a kiss that held all the promise of their future, all the joy of their present, all the gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. "Come," Arthur said, offering his arm. "Our life together begins tonight. Let us not waste a moment of it." They walked together through the house that was now fully theirs, up the great staircase, past the portraits of Arthur's ancestors who seemed to smile down with approval. They had fought for this happiness, had risked everything for it, and they had won. Not because the obstacles had disappeared, but because they had found in each other the strength to overcome them. In the years that followed, Arthur and Marian built a life that became legendary in their circle. They divided their time between London and Ashworth Manor, managing the estates with progressive ideas that improved the lives of their tenants. They had children, 3 daughters and 2 sons, each of whom inherited their parents' combination of intelligence and heart. They created a home known for its warmth and welcome, where people from all walks of life were received with genuine hospitality. Marian's garden grew and flourished, becoming famous throughout the county as a place of beauty and serenity. She wrote a book about gardening that became unexpectedly popular, not for its technical information, but for its philosophical reflections on growth and patience and the rewards of tending living things with love. Arthur never returned to the cold isolation that had characterized his earlier years. He remained open and warm, engaged with the world, deeply involved in the lives of his family and community. He became known as a fair and generous landlord, a thoughtful magistrate, a man whose earlier reputation for coldness was replaced by one of wisdom and compassion. Eleanor lived long enough to see her first 3 grandchildren born, to watch her son's transformation become permanent, to know that her hopes had been realized beyond her wildest dreams. She died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family, her final words expressing gratitude for a life well lived and a son well loved. As Arthur and Marian grew old together, they never lost the sense of wonder at what they had found, the gratitude for the courage that had allowed them to reach for happiness, despite all the reasons they might have chosen safety instead. They told their story to their children and grandchildren, not as a fairy tale, but as a testament to the power of love to heal old wounds, to overcome obstacles, to transform lives. On their 50th anniversary, surrounded by family and friends in the garden Marian had created, Arthur stood and raised his glass in a toast. His hair was white now, his face marked by the passage of time, but his eyes when they found his wife were as full of love as they had been that long-ago night in the conservatory, when everything had changed. "To my Duchess," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering. 50 years ago I asked her what she could offer me. She believed she had nothing to give but her love. She was wrong, of course. She gave me everything. She gave me life itself, returned to me after years in darkness. She gave me hope and joy and purpose. She gave me children and a home and a reason to wake each morning grateful for another day. But most of all, she gave me herself, and that, as I told her on the night we met, was always enough. It will always be enough. Marian, her own hair silver but her eyes still the remarkable grey that had first captured him, smiled at her husband with all the love of 5 decades together. "And you," she said softly, though everyone leaned in to hear, "you taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to risk everything for what truly matters. You taught me that love is always worth the cost, that happiness is worth fighting for, that 2 people who refuse to give up on each other can overcome anything. You have been my partner, my love, my home. And yes, your love has always been enough. It will always be enough." They kissed then, surrounded by applause and tears and laughter, 2 elderly people who had found each other across impossible distances and who had never, for a single day, regretted the choice they had made to be brave, to be vulnerable, to be alive. Their story became part of the family legend, passed down through generations as both inspiration and instruction. It taught that social position matters less than character, that courage in the face of fear is the truest nobility, that love, when it is genuine and fought for and cherished, can indeed conquer all. And in Marian's garden, which continued to bloom long after both of them had passed, roses climbed the walls in joyous abandon, herbs spread their fragrance without restraint, and everything grew a little wild and entirely beautiful, just as she had always believed a garden should be, just as she had helped a frozen heart learn to grow and bloom again. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey through Arthur and Marian's love story, a tale that began in silence and sorrow and blossomed little by little into a life built on courage, tenderness, and second chances. As you step away from Ashworth Manor, perhaps you carry with you the reminder that it is never too late to open the heart, to risk again, and to believe that joy can be replanted even in soil once marked by loss. May their story inspire you to tend your own inner garden with patience and hope, to choose connection over fear, and to recognize that genuine love, be it romantic, familial, or the simple kindness shared between souls, is always worth the effort it demands. If this narrative touched you, share it with someone who needs to remember that life can begin anew at any season, and stay with us for more stories where hearts heal, bloom, and learn to love again.